Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to 2019. And I just need to do a little bit of a setup of what we're doing here for the next month, because the talks for the next month are going to overlap and lead one into the other and then back and forth as we come back and we sort of address the foundation of what this teaching called the science of mind is all about. So just a little bit about the teaching itself as we get into this. If you notice in the title of the textbook, and it is called a textbook because it is made to be studied, and it's not dogma and creed, but it is a text. It is something that we read and we study and we discuss, and we decide what we agree with and what we don't agree with, and how does what we're reading relate to other things that we have heard or read. We're growing. It's a process of education, which is drawing out of, which is what the word educate means. Right, the traditional teaching system, for convenience, I believe, has become what people refer to as the banking system. The teacher has all the information, the student has none. The teacher stands, the students sit. The teacher speaks, the students listen. The teacher asks, the student answers. And the teacher has what the student needs, which is a grade. And if the student does what the teacher wants, the student gets a passing grade, and then they move on to the next class. And whether they actually learned anything or retained anything is not as important as the fact that they've moved on. But there's a different way of looking at education, and that is to recognize and to understand that particularly adults have a world of experience. They have a lot of years of observing the world around them, of forming opinions about the world around them, about reading different things and studying different things. And what a true educator does is finds a way to tap into that and then to draw that knowledge out, to bring it out, the Socratic method. When we start to approach this then from a spiritual perspective, we go even deeper and we say that not only do we as human beings have a world of experience to draw from, but we all, because we are connected to that one source, we all have access to that unlimited information, to that knowledge which comes to us not through logic and reason, but which comes to us directly into our awareness without process. So in that regard, what we want to recognize is that this teaching that is called science of mind, and mind is with a capital M, and whenever you see in the textbook words like that are capitalized, that means God. It means it is referring to God. So if you see love or spirit or principle or things like that capitalized, Dr. Holmes is pointing out to us there's a difference there between the vernacular and the ordinary use of the word mind. So the science of mind is a teaching. It is not a religion. There is no dogma and creed, right? There's no like Apostles' Creed that we have to sit and recite and say this is what I believe, and we're required to believe that in order to be considered members of the organization. And we don't have ethical construct, which when scholars look at religions, they look for what is the dogma and creed and what is the ethical construct. Ethical construct being, for example, 10 Commandments. So we don't have that. We don't tell people how they ought to behave. We believe that people already know how they ought to behave, and we try to help them get in touch with that knower within. The closest thing that Dr. Holmes comes to with regard to ethical construct is he asks us to consider before we do anything, does it give a greater expression to life or to love or to truth or to beauty? And if you answer at least one of those, then he asks, Does this thing harm anyone in any way? Physically harm them? Or does it take anything away from anyone? And what he says is, if that which we desire to do gives a greater expression to life or love or truth or beauty, and it harms no one, then there's nothing against us. There's no reason for us not to do it. That's the closest I would say that if you study with us in Science of Mind, this is close as you will come. So Science of Mind is a teaching. It's not a religion. It is a teaching. And what it does is it draws from all of the great religions and philosophies of the world, and it looks at the common threads. You know, I love Ralph Waldo Trine's work where he says there's a silver thread that runs through all religions. Let's find that silver thread. Let's follow that thread, because this appears to be some sort of a common idea, perhaps a truth. Perhaps not, but we need to follow it, and we need to inquire, and we need to ask what this is all about. And Dr. Holmes looked across different religions of the world, different philosophies of the world, and he kind of assembled the ideas and presented them in the format that he called Science of Mind, with a capital M. And the book that we come to use has become known as the textbook. And we have standardized on the 1937 edition of the textbook. Now, I'll tell you, there was a previous one. There was one that was written in 1926. It is available on the internet because it's in the public domain. It was at this time. And you can find it if you just search for Science of Mind 1926 textbook. You can put it on your tablet or your phone, and you can read it anytime you want. But what happened is as more and more groups came to study the science of mind, and the movement started as a study group movement. It was not necessarily a church with Sunday services. The only requirements that people had when they went to the field as teachers or ministers was to hold a meeting at least once a week, and in that meeting to have a talk that discussed the ideas related to what is taught in the Science of Mind text, or similar ideas. That was it. So with regard to dogma and creed and all those things, that was it. That was it. Get together once a week, kick around some ideas based on what we read in the textbook, based on other ideas that we read, and let's explore these things. Let's explore these things as adult learners, as students who are interested in the deeper questions of life. And that's what Holmes is telling us. He says, if we look at the stars in the heaven, there are more stars than we can count. If we look at the grains of sand in a handful of the beach, there are more than we can count. Yet mankind finds itself weak, tired, and afraid. And he then goes on to say, the science of mind, the teaching, the science of mind, deals with these questions. So this is why I started the opening treatment with curiosity. We have to be curious. We have to ask. We have to be willing to ask. We have to be willing to answer. We have to be willing to admit that perhaps we don't know. Perhaps there are other ways. Perhaps there are better ways. And to objectively explore without the need or the desire to be right and to impose our understanding of what is right on a situation or on another, but to truly question with just for the sake of discovering intention, discovering truth, if truth can be discerned at all. What is truth? Whose version of the truth, These are important questions that we stumble across. And if we're not curious people, if sometimes people will say, I can't deal with that, that's beyond my ability. I don't have time for this. I've got to get and go to work. And that's fine. I understand that. We understand that. But other people are curious, and they say, yeah, well, what about that? What about that? How come? I love some of the Dalai Lama's talks. He says, if there's only one God, how come there's so many different religions? And the Dalai Lama says, because there's one religion that's right for each person, and that's your religion. Whatever that may be, that's yours, and that's the one you need to follow. There was a meme going around Facebook last week, and it was a quote that was attributed to Thich Nhat Hanh, and I didn't go back and verify it. Usually I do. I'll go back and try to verify the source before I mention something. So I'll just tell you, I didn't verify this one, so it may not be entirely correct. But the gist of what was posted said that Buddhism is a practice, not a religion. That it's perfectly, you can be a perfectly good member of some other religion and still practice Buddhism, and it will help you become a better adherent of that particular religion. Science of Mind is the same way. Right? We have had people come study with us from many different religions and bring the richness of their background to us and take the things that we were teaching and try to relate them to what they have learned and what they have taught. There are people who have read Emmett Fox's works. You know, Emmett Fox wrote the Sermon on the Mount and the Ten Commandments were a couple of his first books that became very popular. As a matter of fact, just a little history there, before AA had the Blue Book, they used the Sermon on the Mount. They used Emmett Fox's Sermon on the Mount. Apparently, Bill Wilson, somebody in Bill Wilson's secretary or somebody like that, they had a family member who went to Emmett Fox's church in New York City. And the ideas kind of crossed over. But people have read Emmett Fox's work, and regardless of what particular denomination they may have belonged to, they've read that and said, oh, he's one of us. He's one of us. See? Truth has a broad appeal if we don't get caught up in trying to label it ours. You know, this is what we teach. So if people come in open-minded, they can look at that and say, oh yes, this is how, when I read the Science of Mind textbook, this is how it relates to what I've learned when I grew up in, and then they will name their particular religion. Because these are common ideas, these are common truths. Every religion, every philosophy, perhaps, but certainly every religion deals with what theologians call the problem of evil. If God is so good, why do children suffer? Right? The book of Job in the Old Testament, in the Jewish Bible, the book of Job is considered to be, from the point of timeline, the first book written, not Genesis. Genesis was put before it later. And Job, it makes sense to me, intellectually it makes sense, because Job deals with the problem of evil. Here's Job, who's a good man, and all of a sudden he's got all these afflictions upon him, and the book of Job is trying to address that, which is if you look at it, it's a satirical look. Right? People take it literally. It's a satirical look. It starts out with, if you look at the scenario, it starts out with the devil is in heaven making God a bet. Right? So that ought to tell you right there is, you know, this is a teaching story. This is a teaching story. So every religion tries to deal with the issue of, why is there pain and suffering in the world? Why does pain and suffering exist? Buddhism deals with that. Christianity deals with that. Judaism deals with that. Every teaching kind of deals with it in one way or another. And so does Science of Mind. So does Science of Mind. So these are some of the burning questions that people ask, the burning questions that people answer. And what Dr. Holmes has done, he's gone through different teachings. It's amazing to me that he grew up in the backwoods of Maine, and yet how well read he was by the time that he was, a relatively young man. He went to, he went to Boston when he was like 19 or so, and he went to work there with one of his family members. I think it was a brother. And there he went to work for a man whose wife was a Christian Science practitioner. And Dr. Holmes went and studied with her. and became exposed to the ideas of Christian Science. He extensively read Emerson when he got there. And he said that reading Emerson's essays was like taking a drink of cool water on a hot day. He finally found somebody else who was thinking along the same lines that he was thinking. And he seemed to immerse himself in different philosophies. He was well read in some of the Eastern works. The Life Divine by Sri Aurobindo, which is also available on the internet, he recommends, and it's an excellent work. But I've been reading it for years, and I'm up to chapter 5 now because it's that thought-provoking. But Dr. Holmes, he was a reader. His mother called him the little question mark. He was a curious person. And I hope to kind of instill, as we go off in these 4 chapters in January, that you want to think about an inquiring mind. You want to think about a young man, a young boy growing up who's constantly asking why, constantly asking why. Ernest's brother Fenwick wrote a loving biography of him, of Ernest, and in it he relates one story that I think will kind of give you the context of how he grew up. And of course, he was born in the late 1880s, I think, in Bethel, Maine. And the family would go to church by horse and buggy. And one Sunday, the father was driving the team and was driving the family back. And he stopped the horses and pulled them over to the side of the road. And the father said to the children, he says, I don't want to say anything bad about the preacher, but when he said God sees you as a worm crawling in the dust, he says that was just plain wrong. That was just plain wrong. So he grew up in a home where this idea of worthiness and value was kind of emphasized more than perhaps in some traditional teachings. And he was encouraged to think, and encouraged to think differently. His mother called him the little question mark. So just keep that in mind. Keep in mind this inquiring young man, this curious young man who's reading Emerson and going, oh yes, I've kind of always believed that. Yes, I hear people say that to me all the time. And they read the Science of Mind textbook and say, I've always thought this way. I just didn't know anybody else thought like this. And Ernest moved to Venice, California, where his older brother Fenwick had a church out there. Fenwick was a Congregationalist preacher, which the Congregationalists, they're kind of like the descendants of the Puritans. And Fenwick had a Congregationalist church out there, and Ernest came and got a job in the city of Venice, working for the Parks Department, I believe, in purchasing. And the two of them would go out and teach classes on Emerson's essays, and they became known as the Emersonian lecturers. And that's kind of where all this started, from Ernest's point of view, from the history of going back to find the beginning of Ernest and his works. I think his first book was published around 1919. It too is in public domain, and it was called Creative Mind and Success. So you can imagine this young man who's discovering these things, who's saying, oh my goodness, other people have thought about this before me. I can relate to this, I can't relate to that. Look, this is what's common, this is what's not. Let's put this together. And this is how this thing called the textbook came about. So I just give you that little start because I invite you to consider yourself a student, not an adherent. Right? Religions create adherents. Religions create discipline and people who will follow rules. And religions give us dogma and creed, which we are told to believe and to accept. And they give us a code of behavior, and we're told that we need to behave this certain way or we can't belong to that organization. Right? You see this. You see this in the news. Some particular denomination excommunicated somebody because they didn't like something they did or they said in public. Here it's okay to ask. Here it's okay to question. Here it's okay to say, well, I believe this, but I'm not so sure I believe that, because that's okay. See, that's how the educational process works. That's how drawing out works. We have to examine. We have to go in and look around. We have to poke around and ask ourselves the tough question. I think the toughest question you could ever ask yourself or anybody else is, how do I know what I believe? How do I know what I believe? The starting point, if you want to consider a starting point, an entry point into this exploration of mind with a capital M, I would say the starting point is, it's done unto you according to your belief. That's point number one. And point number two is that spiritual mind treatment, or sometimes it's called affirmative prayer, is a specific technique that we use to change our beliefs. That's probably, if you ask me to give it to you in a nutshell, that's what it would be. Done unto you according to your belief. Spiritual mind treatment is a technique that helps you to change that belief. That's all. That's a place to start. Now, like anything else, once you get started, you find that it leads more and more places. You know, you're going down the rabbit hole. There's this, there's that, there's the other thing, and that's good, because we have to start someplace that appeals to us, right? We have to begin at what seems reasonable to us, at what interests us. But once we kind of get in, and once we start studying, we find that it leads us to even deeper questions of life. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? If it is done unto me according to my belief, how would I know? How would I know that? You know? What is belief? Where do beliefs come from? Are there other ways of believing? Or people who believe differently, do they have it done unto them differently? You know? And then you start to get into even deeper questions. Why? See, who, as St. Paul said in the New Testament, who am I that God is mindful of me? We start to get into the exploration then of, well, why? Why is it that there appears to be this something in the universe? For lack of a better term, we will call it the law of mind. The doer of the word, perhaps the Holy Spirit in some traditions. The doer of the word. Why does this respond to me? Who am I that thou art mindful of me? All of this starts to lead us into a deeper exploration then of, what is this thing called God? What is this thing called God as it relates to me? Am I separate and apart from it? Am I indeed an expression of it? What might that be? And as we progress, as we go along, Dr. Holmes tells us we eventually reach the point where all we want is to be at home with the beloved. That's all we want. Don't want to read anymore, don't want to study anymore. Don't want to change conditions in my life anymore. I just want to be at home with the beloved. And this is the progression of the evolution of the soul. You know, this is the progression that we talk about all the time. We move from the first level, which is all about, you know, conditions and behaviors. We come into a teaching like this and we want to improve conditions. Then we move through a period of learning, an intense period of learning, and it may take a lifetime or more, I don't know. And eventually we get to the mystical. I just want to be at home with thee. So science of mind as a teaching in the text, and I didn't finish my thought on the text. We standard on the 1937 edition because teachers started to put forward lesson plans. They would say, well, if you refer to page 247, paragraph 3, it says this, and by keeping every subsequent edition to 1937 the same, all of those lesson plans stay current. Right? So you can go back and read a lesson plan written by a minister or a teacher in 1940, and the references will all be the same. So the science of mind then, as the text, as the teaching, to me, it is a text or a guide that prods us prods us along on our spiritual growth in a very practical way, a very practical way. Now, the reason I talk about this every January, the reason we go back every January and we start at the beginning, is twofold. One is whatever you do, whatever endeavor in life you're engaged in, there are certain fundamentals that you have to have mastered. You have to know what they are. When I was a kid playing football, the coach would constantly talk about blocking and tackling, blocking and tackling. That's what you got to do. You got to block. Because I was a lineman. You got to block and tackle. Carrying the ball was somebody else's job. Block and tackle, block and tackle. That's all you do. Those were the fundamentals. That's what I was drilled on. How do you block? How do you tackle? How do you block? How do you tackle? Later in life, I learned how to play golf, which was a lot easier than getting hit in the head playing football. But there were certain fundamentals. You had the stance, you had the grip, you had the swing. And you had to learn those things. And those things were important to practice. And you had to build them in a certain order, because if your stance wasn't right, your grip and your swing would be off. If your grip was off, your swing would be off, you know. So you had to make sure you had the right stance. Then you had to make sure you had the right grip, and then you had to make sure that you had the right swing. And once you learned those fundamentals, you would go back and you would practice, you know. Jack Nicklaus in his book said to just get a 5-iron and go out to the range and hit 3,000 or 4,000 golf balls until you can make it go anywhere you want, and then get another club and go practice, practice, practice. Now, over time, what happens to us is we sometimes forget those fundamentals. We get lazy or lax or sloppy, perhaps is a better word, and something goes wrong. Something goes wrong in our life. To go back to the example of golf, we're not playing as well as we used to. And then what we do is we get a coach. We get a behavior coach. We get a coach who understands the fundamentals, and that coach looks at us and says, well, why are you standing that way? Let's try a different stance. And they correct your stance. And then they say, now look at your hands. Why are you standing that way, you know? Why do you have your pinkies hooked together like that? That's, are you sure you want to do that? Let's try holding your hands a different way. And they get you to go back to a proper grip. And then they look at the swing and they say, well, how did you start the swing? Did you start the swing by moving your hip out, or however it is you're supposed to start a swing? I don't remember anymore. But my point is that you need to go back to the basics from time to time. And in something that is behavioral, like a sport, somebody else can observe you. Somebody who knows what's going on can observe you and give you the feedback. But now we are talking about what you believe. In Science of Mind, we're talking about what you believe. It's done unto you according to your belief. And there are certain basics, you see. So we have to go back every once in a while. We do it every January. We go back to the basics. What is it that I believe? What is this thing called God? How does this thing called God work? How does that involve me? How does it even relate to me? Is God out there somewhere? I'm over here. And we bring ourselves back to this very basic idea, or very basic ideas. What is God? Who am I as it relates to God? How does God work or get things done? And is there a way that I can cooperate with this creative process? Is there a way that I can participate in it consciously? I can deliberately choose to participate in this. So this is why every January we come back. And the other important point about what I just said is, this isn't golf. You can't get a coach to look at you and say, oh, why are you holding your hands like that? Why are you standing like that? Now, the best a teacher can do in teaching the basics is to help you understand the techniques and the process of spiritual mind treatment, and why they are there, and how they work, and how to use them. But I can't tell you what you believe. Right? You're the only one. You're the only one in the entire universe who is capable of reflecting upon your own thought. See, responsibility means that you have the ability to respond. It also means that you're the one that's going to do it, right? Accountability means that you get to experience the consequences of doing or not doing what you were supposed to do. You understand that. We understand that in business. We understand that in any organization. Somebody might be in charge and they delegate a task. And suddenly I've made you responsible if I'm the one delegating. But if it doesn't go right, I'm the one that gets fired. See? So I'm accountable. Now, of course, if there's a delay, I'll fire that person first because misery loves company. That's the way it works. But you are the only one who is able. Therefore, you are the only one who is responsible to understand what you believe. And you are held accountable to that. Not by some judging God off in the sky somewhere who's writing down in a book whether you naughty or nice. But it's done unto you according to your belief. Done unto you according to your belief. So if you don't change your beliefs, you continue to get more and more and more of whatever you are getting. If you do change your belief, how do you know that you've changed your belief? And Dr. Holmes tells us that we're very practical. He says this is not a Pollyanna attitude. This is not, Scarlett O'Hara. We won't worry about that today. We'll worry about that tomorrow. That when we see the change result in our lives, we will know that we have changed our belief. So what we are on then is we are on this journey together of trying to understand what belief is. How do I arrive at beliefs? How do I change beliefs? And can I learn how to become very effective and very efficient in developing a technique that will help me to change my beliefs, this thing that we call treatment. Now, mind you, Dr. Holmes says it doesn't matter what process you use, as long as you change your belief, you'll get a different result, because the fundamental thing we're working with, the entry point, is it's done unto you according to your belief. Right? Old Testament and Proverbs says, as you think and believe in your heart, so are you. New Testament, the message seems to be pray. When you pray, pray believing in your heart that it is so and it shall be done. And of course that makes us ask the question, well, God already knows what I want or need. Why do I have to pray believing? Because it's done unto you according to your belief. Your belief. Buddhism tells us that everything that we experience is a result of what we have thought. Buddhism also tells us that pain and suffering enter the world through our erroneous thoughts, beliefs, emotions, and actions. Right? Karma. So you can see this thread then, you can see this idea kind of running through different teachings. The Stoics said what the mind can believe, what the mind can conceive and believe, the mind can achieve. Dr. Holmes told us, change your thinking, change your life. So we have this idea kind of running through different religions, different philosophies, different teachings, but it goes back thousands and thousands of years. Now, how do we know things? How do we learn things? As human beings, as students, as scientists. He calls us scientists, the science of mind. And by the way, religious science was the name of the organization that was put in place to teach the science of mind. That's the name of the organization. And when it was first founded, it was a teaching institute. It was not a church or a religion. It was a teaching institute. And there were teaching centers that were established where teachers would go out and teach the principles of the science of mind. Later it was found that a lot of people liked to organize it like a church. They wanted to get together, have their meetings on Sunday mornings, bring things in that were kind of churchy. And it more or less evolved that way. Pretty much because that's what people want, I believe. That's what they're used to. But at the very onset, religious science is an organization that was put in place to teach the science of mind, to develop the curriculum, to accredit teachers, to accredit students as they progressed, so that a student could move from one part of the country to another, and they could continue in their studies. So that's kind of the history. That's kind of the history of it. So now we come back to, how do you know? See, how do you know anything? How would you know anything is true? How do I know what I know? How do you know what you know? How does a scientist know what a scientist knows? Dr. Holmes starts this chapter off by saying, we all look forward to the day when religion and science shall walk hand in hand from the visible to the invisible. We all look forward to this day when religion and science shall walk together hand in hand from the visible to the invisible. Excuse me, I had to get some water here. So what he's saying is we are all inquiring to the same thing, right? We understand in science, we understand that somehow energy becomes matter, and matter takes form, and we get stars, we get planets, and we get animals, and we get people, and we get things like that. And then somehow that form goes back to energy. We understand that in science, that the physical sciences are the invisible becoming visible and going back into the invisible. That's what science is looking towards. And religion is looking the same way. What is this thing called life? Where did this thing called life come from? What is the power or the force that tells the energy, that makes the energy come forward and take a particular form at a particular time, or to express itself in a particular place, in a particular way? Whether it be, the squirrels in the trees, or elephants, or human beings. If you just stop, if you're curious and you just stop and you think about the diversity of life on this planet, I'm not talking just human life, I'm talking all life. It is absolutely amazing. It is absolutely incredible. Because here we have mammals, we have human beings who live above the surface of the earth, breathe air, breathe oxygen, give off carbon dioxide. We have trees that live above the surface of the earth. They breathe in carbon dioxide. They give off oxygen. We have red blood. The horseshoe crab, which is one of the oldest living organisms on earth, has blue blood. And its immune system is so perfected that they actually use the blood of the horseshoe crab when they're testing batches of medicine. Believe it or not, you folks down at the coast probably familiar with it, but there are folks who just capture horseshoes, and they take them someplace where they stick a needle into the tail and they draw blue blood out of the horseshoe crab, and then they take the horseshoe crabs back and let them loose. And they can take a batch of medicine that they're working on, and they can put a drop of it into that blue blood. And if there's any contaminant in the batch, just dirt or something wrong in there, that blue blood will begin to congeal around it. The antibodies are so perfect in that. We have red blood. They have blue blood. We breathe oxygen. And if you go down to the volcanic vents, in the deepest trenches of the ocean floor, there are creatures down there that breathe in the gases that would kill us. They breathe them in from the vents, and they live off of that. And if you brought them up here, they would die, and if we went down there, we would die. but yet there's something common that is expressing itself through all of these different forms of life. At least that's our assumption, that's our starting point. And we want to move from the visible back into the invisible. And we want to walk hand in hand. We want to do it in a sort of a scientific process, if you want, as best we can. We want to observe and we want to experiment. So for all of recorded history, and we could assume before that, but for all of recorded history, there's this idea, the human beings have this idea that there's some power that created all of this. And what is that power? And there's also this idea that through some sort of interaction with that power, through prayer, through ritual, through sacrifice, through changing your attitude, be positive. All of these different things, that there is something that can be done that is a movement within thought that then produces results or changes in our lives. So if we go and we look at that and we say, remember I mentioned a few weeks ago, Desmond Morris said if we came to Earth and we looked at human beings as a zoologist might look at them, we would say that human beings were the naked ape. And then I went on to say, but there's something different, right? There's something different between human beings and our cousins in the forest. And we can become aware of what we are thinking. We don't know whether or not the animals can, but we know that we can. We can become aware of what we are thinking, and we can deliberately choose to change what we are believing. We can do that. So if we came to Earth and we looked at human beings, we would look all around and say, well, human beings have this belief in some sort of a higher power, for lack of a better term. And they believe that somehow through movement in their thought, in their own thought, or through the thoughts of an intercessory, but it starts with the thought of the individual who goes to the shaman and says, I need this help. That somehow by a movement in thought, conditions change. And if you look at the creation mythologies of the world, the explanation that people have for how the world came to be, it was through a movement in thought, God said, let there be. And there was. God said, let there be. So Dr. Holmes just tells us at the beginning, and I can tell you over the next month, we are going to go back and forth with these ideas over and over again. So today is not a complete, if you will, beginning, middle, and end, because the beginning, middle, and end are going to occur over a four-week period. I just want you to, if you will, for this week, stop and consider, what are your ideas about God? What are your ideas about God? Is God an old man with a white beard sitting up on a throne in the sky? Is God an impersonal power that just sort of operates like gravity, just sort of operates through the universe? Is God a personal God who listens to everybody and changes the rules based on how well somebody begs or pleads or beseeches? What are the different ideas of this thing called God that are out there that you know about? Where did your ideas of God come from? Were they something that was given to you as a small child in a Sunday school? Was it something that just evolved over time? Was there a lot of conscious thought that went into it? Did you spend a lot of time thinking about this? The interesting thing I would like to leave us with for today, the interesting thing that I would ask you to consider today is that we really don't know where our ideas come from. We think we do. An idea comes up and we say, oh, that's my idea. And we believe it because it's ours, right? It's familiar. It's our idea. It's kind of like going to the nursery in the hospital, and they've got all of these beautiful babies laid out there in their little bassinets and their little blankets, some pink and some blue, They're all beautiful, they're all precious, and we look at that one and we say, that one's ours. That one's ours, And very easily you could look at anyone, say, we love that one. Our ideas are the same way. These ideas seem to bubble up in our consciousness. We become aware of them, and then we say, that's ours, that's mine, and I believe it. And if you are really going to be a student of the science of mind, you're going to have to come back and say, is that really my idea? Why do I have to believe it just because I became aware of it? Have I ever become aware of things that are not true? Critical thinking. How do you know what you know? So we need to start at the beginning, because our concept of God, our idea about what this thing called God is and what our relationship with this thing called God is, it sets the foundation for the rest of our life. Our entire life kind of flows from that. If God is a mean, punishing God, we have a tough life. If God is a warm, kind, and loving God, we have a different kind of life. If God is completely impersonal and has nothing to do with me, we have another kind of life. If God is personal, is God changing the rules because of me? Because I want the rules changed? Or is there something else going on? So these are these are the questions, or the substance of life. These are the things that we need to explore, and these are what we try to explore every week, coming at them from a different way, a different aspect every week. But just coming at them from different ways every week is of no help unless we are willing to go in and do the practice. Just having a golf coach tell you change your grip is no good. Doesn't do you any good. You got to go in there and practice. So what I invite us to practice this week is self-reflection, introspection. Where do your ideas come from? What ideas about God do you hold? The thing itself, the essence, the first cause, whatever you want to call it. That's why Holmes called it the thing. Right? Because everybody you use the word God and everybody thinks they know what you're talking about. And everybody's got a totally different understanding. Where do these ideas come from? Why do you believe them? What other ways are there of believing? And here's the big one I ask you to consider this week till we get together next week. Can you observe, observation and experiment, can you observe how your ideas of God and your relationship to God and with God, can you observe how those ideas have been outpicturing in your life? The only place you have to experiment is in your own consciousness. The only place you have to observe is in your own consciousness, and you are the only one who can do that, because I can't look into your head and tell you what you're thinking. Your spouse can't look into your head and tell you what you're thinking. But you have to become mindful. You have to stop, and you have to ask yourself, what do I think about that? Why do I think it? Where did it come from? And the last point for today is, be willing as you do that to let go of anything that no longer serves. In other words, don't hold on to it just because you believed it for a long time. If you believe the wrong thing for a long time, holding on to it longer is not going to help you. So don't fall in love with your thoughts just because you thought they were yours. Let them go. Let them go. And we'll pick up next week. We're going to talk some more about this. We're going to talk some more about the creative process. some of the people like Thomas Troward who had an influence on Dr. Holmes. And we're going to start to get into this interaction then, this interaction of conscious mind, subconscious mind, will, volition, impersonal law, personal love, all of those things. These are the things that life is made of. Namaste. Have a good week. And so it is.